Good morning, everyone. We find ourselves in the next chapter of the Bible. We left off with 1 Samuel 29, where David and his men had been dismissed by the king of Gath, Achish, because the other Philistines were worried that David and the Hebrew men would act as opposition to the Philistines that were attacking the Israelites. Um, so we're gonna conclude the story of Saul and then talk about David right after that, because actually we're gonna talk about these chapters in reverse order. In the Bible, it goes chapter 30, chapter 31. Chapter 30 is about what David does after him and his men are dismissed from the army. Chapter 31 talks about what happens with Saul, and we're going to continue. We're going to finish the story of Saul. So we left off with Saul going to Endor to receive advice from a medium, or someone who speaks with spirits in a sense. And this person had Samuel rise up from the dead, or be able to talk with Saul at least. And Samuel said, Saul, tomorrow will be the last day on earth. The day after, or after tomorrow, you will be with me. You and your sons will join us in the death, that is. And so we hear of what happened to Saul at this time. And the Philistines had gathered together and had created an extremely large army, and they were in competition with the Israelites. And the Israelites do not have good, this is from a while ago, but the Israelites don't have solid weapons. They don't have weapons of metal. They have mostly farm implements and spears and those sorts of things. So the Philistines have significantly better armor and weapons. And really the only way that the Israelites have been able to survive in the situation they find themselves in right now has been the fact that God has been protecting them and making things benefit them, and sort of allowing them to win battles and causing battles to be won. So it really doesn't fall on the Israelites. And we can sort of see this when Saul goes to battle against the Philistines. He's destined to die, and the passage doesn't even go into any details about the fight. It literally starts with, now the Philistines fought against Israel, the Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. Mount Gilboa, just a little bit back. Go and find this for a second. Mount Gilboa is right over here. You can see my mouse. They gathered in Shunem. He went to Endor, and Mount Gilboa is where they die. So it's not long after. Saul and the Israelites are fleeing and are getting captured, and all of Saul's sons are captured, and they're also killed, including Jonathan, which is going to cause David obviously some grief. And David likely knows the other sons of Saul, but Jonathan is the one he has a very close relationship with. And so Saul attempts to flee from this routing, but he's wounded pretty badly. And he has an opportunity where he's still alive, but he knows that the other army is going to overtake him very soon. And so he asks his armor bearer to kill him. Because he's been injured so badly, he asks the armor bearer to take his life, and so that they will not abuse him before he dies. His armor bearer was unwilling to do so, though, and so Saul fell on his own sword and finished his own life. And then the armor bearer, witnessing Saul dying, also killed himself. And what happened here is kind of an interesting thing. In those days, suicide was seen as just not the right thing to do. And there was all these sort of nuances to the way that people thought about suicide, and even now that idea is still changing over time. But what we can take away from it is the fact that Saul died at the hands of himself, and that sort of really gives an image of what happened to Saul over his kingdom. He really caused himself to fail. He made lots of decisions for his own benefit, and that sort of led to his inevitable death. Just like Saul's physically taking his life, he really sort of caused this to happen in the first place by the actions he's chosen to take part in, from causing his men to eat raw meat because they're savagely hungry, or taking it upon himself to offer sacrifice to God when he wasn't supposed to. These different decisions that he's made over his lifetime that has sort of caused him to be in this situation, and so it sort of ends justifiably with him killing himself. Now, what happens here is the Israelites flee. And not just the Israelite army, but also the people that live in the towns and cities. And the Philistines essentially take over a part of Israel. They occupy the towns, they occupy the cities, they occupy the forts, and it becomes Philistine land. And Saul has died. He has his head cut off. His armor taken away. Messengers are sent throughout the land in Philistia, to proclaim the news that that Saul was dead. They put his armor among the idols into the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fashioned his body against the wall of Beth Shen. And all of this to proclaim the power Philistia has over Israel and the fact that they've been so solidly beat. Now, we do hear of a story from some courageous men who eventually make the decision to cross over the land and to reclaim Saul's body. They are the men from Jabesh Gilead. They go across, they sort of take Saul's body in the middle of the night. They sort of take it away from there, they burn his body, and then they bury his bones underneath a tree. And then they fasted, and there's an entire feast, there's an entire fasting and sort of weeping in all of Israel at this time because of the death of a king. The reason what we think is probably likely it wasn't a common practice for them to burn bodies back in those days, but likely Saul's body was so disfigured at that point that it didn't really make sense to bury him as is, or maybe his body would be desecrated even more so. So they made the decision to burn his body instead, and then bury his bones. So that's the story of what happens with Saul. Now, while this is all happening, transpiring, David and his men return back to Ziklag, because they haven't heard about this yet. They left the battle sort of quickly, or they left before the battle started because they were asked to. They returned to Ziklag. Now, when they leave Ziklag, they leave it completely defenseless. And David has made some enemies in the past because of what he's been doing in invading the Amalekites. So, what happens is the Amalekites actually invade and attack Ziklag, as well as some other towns, Negev, and they capture everyone there. They take all of the people prisoners. They don't kill anyone, but they carry them all off. And when the men return back to Ziklag, David's 600 men, they are very upset. They are weeping. They're angry. David's concerned about his wives, and they're all very angry, and they almost want to kill David. That's how upset they are with him because of what's happened. And David asks Abiathar to inquire of the Lord, who is rightfully the high priest at this point because he is the last of the priests that Doeg the Edomite had not killed. And God says that, or God gives the response that you should pursue them and overtake these people who have taken your family. And so what David and his men do is they run for 3 days. And they pursue them quite aggressively. They get to a point where they have barely eaten any food, and they're indicated where they should go. And they go and track down the men, but completely exhausted. They fight for a full day, and they end up capturing all their families back and be able to return back to Ziklag after killing all those who had taken them. And David still hasn't heard about what's happened, but he does make a wise decision here where at the time there were 600 men that went with him. And they're pursuing so aggressively that only 400 of them were able to continue on into the battle. 200 of them opted to stay behind with the baggage and whatever they were taking with them because they were so exhausted. And when the 400 returned from where they were, like after the battle, they had a lot of plunder, and they originally were like, well, we're not going to share it with you guys because you guys didn't participate. But David sort of changes that and says, no, they did their job too. Just because they had to stay with the plunder doesn't mean that they didn't want to help. And that sort of changes the mindset of those soldiers moving forward, where it's more of a community sort of thing, something where everyone sort of benefits from it, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It doesn't really have a lot of life application to us in that sense because we just don't live in times like that. But it's just one more step into David sort of thinking of other people instead of himself. And we've already seen that contrast between Saul and David. And at this time, his men began to roam to different towns, and they were sort of welcomed in different regions. Again, they still haven't heard about Saul being killed yet, but that sort of concludes the final chapters of Saul's life. So 1 Samuel 31 and 1 Samuel 30 are the two chapters that we finished. And we're going to be starting on 2 Samuel 1 in a few days' time, and sort of kicking off where we left off. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have an excellent day.